As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
In the motivational interviewing world, we're using, very basic skills of like reflective listening, like active listening. We might affirm people's strengths. We can ask them evocative questions to build this momentum around the change talk. We acknowledge the places where people are having what we call the sustained talk and the status quo, like, hey, you really like alcohol. And I'm also hearing that there's a part of you that's really thinking about making some changes, right? So we're trying to help lead someone down a path of exploration using their own language.
That was Kristin Dempsey on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
I'm Yael Schonbrun, a clinical psychologist, faculty at Brown University, author of Work, Parent Thrive, and a biweekly newsletter on relationships.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. Hello, everyone. This is Michael, and I'm sitting here with my favorite Yael to discuss my interview on harm reduction for addiction that I did with the fantastic Kristin Dempsey. And Yael, I know that you have a history in addiction research as well.
Yes. And in fact, I used to do research on motivational interviewing with a bunch of different presentations for people who were trying to stop cigarette use, for people who were trying to cut down on alcohol. And so this interview and this idea of harm reduction and trying to help people figure out how to do behavior change in ways that are value aligned, that work for them, and that help us to ally with them as opposed to get into an adversarial relationship is so, so important. And I just want to say too, and you guys get into this isn't just for addiction. It's really much broader than that. It's really for thinking about change in general.
Yes. What I took away from this book myself was that I could apply many of those lessons that I learned for a lot of things in my life, like getting up a little bit earlier, working out a little bit more steadily, eating a little bit healthier. And I think that's important to point out right at the beginning of this interview as well. Even if you, dear listener, don't struggle with substance abuse or don't have anyone in your life that struggles with this, I find that the techniques that Kristin talks about, they're so applicable for so many things in life.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I sometimes get into conversations with patients who are struggling with change where people get very much into this binary of like, I can't change, it's too hard, or I should just be able to find like the 1, 2, 3 hack that makes change easy. And the truth is in the middle, like change is possible and it's hard. And so we do need to be able to approach it in a motivated way, in a thoughtful way, in a wise way. And part of what helps us to change, and this is the great irony, the great paradox of psychology, is acceptance. And I wanted to share this quote. I'm obsessed with Carl Rogers, but one of my favorite of his quotes is, The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. And so he's talking about acceptance of ourselves, which is, of course, very, very important. But what Kristin and you talk about so beautifully is how important acceptance is in a relationship with somebody else too. That when we communicate to other people that we really accept them, it gives them more space to consider change. So acceptance for ourselves and acceptance with other people is such an important precursor to change. And one of the things that really good listeners offer us is a sense of being fully accepted. And you and Kristin talk about a lot of really amazing practical skills for good listening. And I just wanted to share, I had recently written in my newsletter, Relational Riffs, about this very cool line of research from an Israeli researcher by the name Guy Ichikov, who studies something that he calls high quality listening. And he describes high quality listening as having 3 distinct components. So this isn't like a 3 quick hack thing for listening. It's actually much deeper than that, because the 3 components really are things that we have to do with deliberate intention. So the first one is paying attention. And I had done an episode not too long ago with marital researcher James Cordova, where he talks about attention as the most basic form of love. But when we're acting as listener, really paying attention to what someone is saying, giving them our wholehearted attention is so important. The second thing is comprehending the other person's points. So not how you understand it, but how they're trying to be understood. And the third component is, and I love this in the context of motivational interviewing, is holding positive intention. It's seeing the good in the other person and seeing the potential inside of them. And when we can hold on to those 3 components, it really does help the other person to feel accepted, to feel understood. And from there, so much more is possible than when people don't have that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that Kristin also emphasizes in her book so much. So we'll definitely have to put that relational riff into the show notes as well, so people can check this out. And now I bring you my interview with Kristin Dempsey on harm reduction for addiction. Kristin Dempsey is a psychotherapist, counselor, educator, and trainer. For 30 years, she has supported individuals with exploring their own relationships to substances. She is a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers, or MINT, and has been privileged to provide motivational interviewing, or MI, training to thousands of people in behavioral health, public care, public health, school, corrections, and human services organizations. Her upcoming book that we discuss today is the Harm Reduction Workbook for Addiction, Motivational Interviewing Skills to Create a Personalized Recovery Plan and Make Lasting Change. Hi, Kristin. It's so good to have you on the show. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Michael. I'm really excited to be here. I'm a big fan of the show.
Oh, thank you so much. So let's talk about harm reduction. Your book is the Harm Reduction Workbook for Addiction, and it's about harm reduction. Oh, obviously, I mean, that's in the name, right? With harm reduction with substance abuse, and it's using motivational interviewing. So I was thinking we could start off with a brief overview of these 3 parts, harm reduction, substance abuse, and motivational interviewing, to get everyone listening settled in and on the same boat.
Yeah, thank you. Right. So this is a unique book in some ways, in that we're bringing together a number of ideas, which really in my work in the last 30 years have often come together in various ways, but to actually have something that people can pick up and read and purchase and work with, there hasn't been a lot. There's been a few books out there, but it's this idea of exactly what the name says, is reducing harm. And it started in public health and is still very much in public health, where it's like thinking about people who might be involved in various risky behaviors. And I first became involved in harm reduction back in the 1980s. I was a teenager, and I was working in San Francisco, and I first got involved in some of the HIV, back in the day we called it AIDS, intervention work, helping folks learn about AIDS and to keep themselves safe. And harm reduction became a really important piece, whether it's, around cleaning and replacing needles for folks who might be using IV drugs, or, condom use, dental dam use, around sexuality and such. So those were really important pieces for that entire movement and having those conversations. And gradually over the years, it really has worked more into the substance use kind of treatment field. Because when I first got into substance use treatment, the idea was, and it still is in many ways, it's about abstinence. Like if you have a substance use disorder or substance use issue, you have some kind of concern, you're somewhere involved with substances and maybe other processes that are consequential for you in ways that, are not good, then you best quit, right? That's kind of the attitude around that. And that doesn't work for a whole lot of people. So harm reduction has been a way of how can we focus more on reducing the harm to the individual person, focus more on individual needs and wellness as opposed to focusing on substance, right? And substance being gone. You have it or not. It's a binary. And for a lot of folks, that's a hard entry. And it's one that they're not necessarily willing or ready or wanting to approach. But this idea of what's your relationship to a substance? Let's look at this and maybe make some different choices. That's been really revolutionary for a lot of folks. And in many ways, motivational interviewing is the how. It's like, how do we do this harm reduction? And motivational interviewing has been around for 40 years. And it's now really considered, it's not like a theoretical orientation in psychology. It's a way of having conversations about change and growth, ways that really engage people in exploring their own interests and desires and reasons for change and growth. And we work with people. It's very much a verbal kind of conversational style. And clinicians have been using it for decades now, and it has a pretty impressive research base, and it's expanded. It started off in the substance use disorder field and behavioral health, public health, and there's people working in education and corrections, all these different areas using it, because it turns out it's really helpful to have ways to talk with people about change and growth that is person-driven, starts where they're willing to start. And what's kind of special then about this book is that we took these skills that we've been teaching providers for decades and put that in the book with this idea that someone could take this and be wondering about their own relationship to substances or processes, and thinking about, how they might start to approach it using some of the ideas that we use in motivational interviewing, and starting to explore, starting to wonder for themselves. So we hope it's a tool that people can really use to actually approach the issue and approach a concern, as opposed to, not feel like they're ready or just feel really alienated from the process.
Because this is a workbook. How does the difference between you guiding someone through that process feel compared to you providing them with a workbook that they then work through on their own mostly?
Yeah, I think certainly when I work with people in person, and I do see people clinically here in the Bay Area, I am able to rather quickly respond to the types of kind of motivational cues that I think might be helpful. I can start to listen for some of the things they're saying that indicate, they're moving towards change. And I'm able to be curious about it and reflect on it and build that. And for someone, say with a workbook, there's definitely some structured exercises where they can go through and really think about, aspects of, say, like self-compassion for themselves or aspects of their values, let's say, and maybe later on, thinking about, do I have a goal here? Do I have something I want to work toward? So it does require people to put that energy in and to kind of go through and, do various pieces in order to get maybe a fuller experience. Whereas maybe in person, I can pivot and provide that a bit more fluidly. However, in the workbook, there's also a lot of control. I wrote it in such a way that you could skip chapters, you could work in different sections. Maybe there's an area I'm ready to focus on this, but not on that. And maybe even as a provider, I would take a minute to kind of figure that out in terms of where someone is willing to start, which I think is fine. I just think it's different. But with the workbook, there is also just this very strong sense of privacy that someone has about, I want to work on this and just have this exploration. And of course, a great option is when someone's able to do this and also work, with a provider or in maybe a self-help kind of situation. We have lots of self-help types of formats and groups now for folks to talk, or mutual aid. Some people like to use the term mutual aid for people to really explore. So I think there's just like a lot of flexibility. And that's really one of the main goals of a book, and really of harm reduction and motivational interviewing, is how do we help increase some flexibility and options?
Yeah.
People really think that, it's not this binary, right? Of like, you're either using or you're not.
Yeah, it's the continuum.
Yeah, it's a continuum, as everything pretty much is.
See, this leads me to a sidebar that when I got in touch with you and you sent me the book, I think there was like crickets on my end for like 2 weeks. And it was because I wanted to work through the book. I opened the book and I felt this itch to fill out those lines that were in the book when those questions were asked. And my brain wanted to I have some ideas around this. Now, I don't struggle with substance abuse, but the ideas that came up for me in this book, and I realized this is more of a sidebar, of course, was that I could use a lot of those questions for other obstacles that I was struggling in my own life with, such as, eating more healthy, working out more. And I know this is such a small concern compared to those that want to look at their substance use. Is that just me, or is that the general applicability of motivational interviewing and me automatically remapping those questions to, in air quotes, lesser concerns in my life?
Yeah, thank you so much. And first of all, I am so delighted that you opened it up and engaged in it. That just, as the person who wrote it and thought about this for so long and so hard, it delights me that you just got so engaged and just explored it. And yes, this happens a lot where people come in, maybe not even knowing or feeling ambivalent or unclear, and just starting to explore, starting to ask or think about some of these really evocative ideas. Maybe I do have something here. And it's not, again, pathological in any way. And it could be a process and not even like a substance use disorder. And that's something I thought about a lot when writing this. We put together these books. The publisher wanted something certainly for like a substance use disorder resource, and people looking for something that might be really helpful. And yet, increasingly we're really aware that whether it's chemical or whether it's a process, folks often really find it helpful to explore their behaviors. And again, it's all along a continuum. So it may not even be anything that's problematic per se, but it's something that might even just be kind of annoying, or just something someone wants to explore. Like, is this really an issue for me? Why do I do this? Can I shift it a little bit? So other things that people often look at that are important increasingly include things like, how much am I watching TV, like binge watching, that kinds of stuff. Like, how often am I on my phone, right? The phone and just all the online stuff and environment. Folks who might be into gambling, shopping. There's also, of course, issues potentially if someone's feeling there's some concerns they have around compulsive sexuality, just other types of behaviors that might fit in to this discussion of, I want to check this out.
Yeah. So I have more than 1 million questions that I want to dive in with you. And I know we won't be able to keep you for that long. So I think there are two options for us. In one way, we could start looking at the different processes that you describe in the book, going into detail on those different processes. And on the other side, there were some, in my own notes, I called them more like counterintuitive things that I learned from the workbook that developed for me almost like themes going through that I saw then a lot in my own life as well. And maybe we can look at these themes and then see how those lead us to discussing some of the processes that are connected to them.
I think that's wonderful.
then the first thing that had me smile and nod in the laughter of recognition was that you explain how we humans, we don't want to be told what to do. And I found that, well, first, that's me, right? This has been me since I was probably like 18 months old. Like, don't tell me what I need to do. And at the same time, while I can totally emphasize with that statement, and I can totally feel it in my bones that that is me as well, there's also this interesting conundrum of someone walking into the office of a healthcare provider asking for help around substance use or something else, and then still being reluctant to kind of take the advice that is offered, where then motivational interviewing and change talk and then all of the good stuff comes in. So why are we so reluctant to just run with the advice that we're given?
Oh, that's such a great question, and actually I have an answer, so I'm so excited to answer this. This is a part of being human, I suppose, and I'm sure there's even more research on this dynamic than I'm even aware of. But we do know in motivational interviewing, we're really aware of the importance of choice and autonomy, and that's such a big piece around the engagement and building this sense of agency and willingness, kind of willingness to open up and change and to take a first step. There is this idea of like, I have to be comfortable with the fact that I have some sense of agency over this, and like, this is my step, and that I'm not being forced into it. And I think all of us kind of can relate to this on some level. And there are probably some cultural pieces as well, of course. But one of the things that we really think about is, when people come in, it's like, well, we want to respect folks as experts in their own life, right? Like, the people really know themselves best. And that's true. And that's, of course, such an important idea. However, people are also coming in to see us. There's a place where they still need some support. So an intervention that we use in motivational interviewing, which I think is brilliant, and I call it brilliant all the time, and I use it a lot, and it is incredibly effective, is this little process. We call it ask, offer, ask. But we ask people when we're thinking about information or advice that we'd like to share as providers. And so one of the first things we do is we ask people, tell me a little more about this. What have you already done? And then that in and of itself can often be a really robust conversation. And there may even be a place where, in this place of someone exploring what's going on for them, we can offer some ideas or suggestions about how they might adjust what they're doing. But that's the first thing we do. And then we might then also ask, hey, as we're having this conversation about this concern, is there anything you'd like to ask me, or anything you'd like information on? So before I'm compelled to provide my own advice that's separate from the person I'm supporting, I give them the chance first to query me. So they get to have that. And so that really reduces some of that pushback sometimes of like, well, no, let me be in the driver's seat here. And then if I still have, some information or advice I'd like to share with someone, and this is really critical, I ask permission. All right, so we don't feature this as much in the workbook because people are asking themselves. I mean, so they're the ones kind of really driving the whole process. But as a provider, I ask permission, and I might even do a little, reflective kind of summary piece of like this. And these are the things we've been talking about. So you've been working really hard and trying to address this, and maybe I even reflect back on some of the things they've been doing. And, and I have some thoughts about things that you've been speaking of, and I would love to share them with you, and you might find them helpful. Is that something you would care for me to share? And, they could say no. And if they say no, I totally respect that. But a lot of people don't. And this, I think, is the key piece is I am boundaried. I'm like, I tell folks when I talk to them about this, I'm like knocking on the door before I ask this question or give this advice or whatever it is I'm going to do. And then in the offering part, it's very brief and very contained. So it's like, if I have advice, I always give a menu of options. So that way, again, it's not this binary of this or here, do this. That's another problem with advice is we give like one thing and it doesn't fit. it's annoying. But if I give a number of different options, maybe including an option that the person I'm supporting has already suggested, that's a very different piece. And then the second part of that is, in addition to being brief and as objective as possible, I also will say, this is up to you really clearly. Like, maybe none of this fits. Maybe a few things here fit. And we can be really creative with this. And then I do a second ask, which is their feedback. So given all these options and different things we're looking at, what would be helpful for you? And in this little process of collaborating with someone, giving them a real option and choice, helping them have options and supporting their autonomy around how they approach that, and then checking in, that is the way to kind of enter, I think, this idea of advice or information in a way that people don't find so repellent. So that's like my favorite technique.
And it also sounds like something that would be very well suited for interpersonal stuff outside of the healthcare provider's office. I think I had to learn this technique the hard way when I was babysitting my little sisters as a teenager. It's like, there was no telling them what to do, give them options. And
that's right. We often learn trial by fire, some of this. Absolutely.
So this might also be a good way to lead us into change talk and the different versions of change talk, and how we as the healthcare provider might elicit that on one side, but also how someone might elicit that change talk by working through the workbook.
Yeah. So change talk is a critical piece of motivational interviewing. It's something that's so critical, in fact, that if I were thinking I was doing motivational interviewing, maybe by asking certain questions or reflecting a particular way, and I wasn't attending to change talk, I wasn't trying to notice that or elicit it and evoke it in some way and work with it, then I'm not actually doing motivational interviewing. Like, it's such a critical piece. And so what it is it's any verbalization that a person makes, like someone who's seeking help, that moves them away from their status quo, whatever that might be, and towards change in some particular way, kind of a very general definition of that. So for instance, if my status quo is one where maybe I'm drinking alcohol daily, and it's part of my life, regardless of, my diagnosis, but I have this daily relationship to alcohol, and I'm saying things like, but I like drinking, it helps me relax, or I like to use it to socialize with my friends. That's something that we often call sustained talk, right? It's part of the language that sustains the behavior. But change talk is noticeably different. And we have a couple different types of it. So, change talk starts to move away from that sustained talk in very specific ways. So we have change talk that is usually very early on in a conversation that often indicates a desire, ability, a reason, or a need to change. And we call it preparatory change talk. So we might be talking with someone maybe very early who's saying things like, yeah, alcohol, it's part of my life. I drink it every day. I wouldn't mind cutting back a little bit. And sometimes people can also just speak to their own abilities. I know I could change my behavior around drinking if I really maybe restructured my life a bit. And what's really important about this preparatory change talk is it can happen very early, and it often happens way before people change their behavior. So one of the things I say is people are talking this talk maybe a bit before they start to walk the walk of change. And so there seems to be this verbal cognitive process. It's, bouncing around in our heads before, behaviorally we're doing something different. Because behavior without, the specific intention behind it often doesn't just automatically change. And so it's important because people are talking themselves into change. And what we're doing in the motivational interviewing world is we're using really just basic skills, very basic skills of like reflective listening, like active listening, right? That the reflecting back, we might affirm people's strengths. Sometimes we summarize their themes. We can ask them evocative questions to build this momentum around the change talk, right? So we acknowledge the places where people are having what we call the sustained talk and the status quo, like, hey, you really like alcohol. And I say and not but. And I'm also hearing that there's a part of you that's really thinking about making some changes. You'd like to have a bit more motivation, and you're wondering if alcohol is really helping with that, right? So we're trying to help lead someone down a path of exploration using their own language and, working with it. So it's a skill set, really, being able to do this. And what we found is when we do that, we're kind of building this momentum around change talk. I often increasing just the amount of it. I often talk in my trainings about we're trying to thicken the change talk soup. We're trying to make it more and more compelling, because what happens is that people will start then to move into, and sometimes we can help with certain evocative questions, into what we call mobilizing change talk, where people will start like making commitments. I'm going to go and check out this meeting, or maybe they're activated but not totally committed. I'm going to try to make it to this meeting, or I'm going to, think about looking at this book that you told me about, right? Or they can even start taking like steps. I went online and I looked at different resources I could explore around, alcohol use or whatever, something I actually already did in order to address this. And this is all really important because I remember early in my training, there was this idea that, first of all, people who had substance use issues weren't honest, right? And that there is a piece of that sometimes is, or maybe oftentimes in some cases, is really true, not because people are inherently dishonest, but because if people don't feel safe, they'll start saying what they feel others want to hear in order to keep themselves safe. And I think that could be really unconscious. So, or conscious, depending on the consequences, right? So sometimes people in treatment programs, even in outpatient programs, when we're scared, there might be minimization, all these other things. But unfortunately, in the field, that's often really shown up as pathologizing folks with substance use concerns. And I think that's really important because I remember people telling me, and I remember thinking myself, oh, this person is saying they want to quit drinking. They're saying that they really need to, but they're still doing it. They must be lying, right? Which is just a horrible thing to say, but not true. And in motivational interviewing, it's like, no, that's of course understandable. You talk about this and you're thinking about it before you actually change the behavior. So that's an opportunity. It's a real opportunity when people are saying, oh, I'd really like to do this. I know I could. And they're starting to envision, starting to imagine what things might be like. We want to be so curious about that. Really? So this is really important to you. You're thinking about making this change. Tell me more about it. Right. And that we're starting to lead down this path. Exactly. We want to reinforce what we want to see, like everything else.
That answered a question that I had as I was going through the material. I was thinking to myself, if I show too much empathy, too much compassion, the person is not going to change anything. If I'm sitting there and I'm saying, yeah, this is, of course, the person is not going to be incentivized to change. But what I hear you say now and clarify this for me is that there's always this looking out for this, like thicken the soup thing of adding some mobilization, some preparation as the healthcare provider, like offering that to the client and then them like internalizing that thought just a little bit. So we're moving like a micrometer more towards the change path.
It is. And you said something really important that I'd like to highlight, which is all of this change talk, all this conversation is happening within a really particular context. So one of the things we talk about in motivational interviewing, and it's often the way that most of us start to train and talk about it when we're working with folks, is this all occurs within this therapeutic stance of compassion, of really, we call it the spirit of MI. It's about being compassionate. Like, what am I doing to help really understand this person, really imagine being in their shoes, and really to help reduce their suffering. And to have that sense of understanding, that very special empathy that comes with compassion. We also come from a place of partnership. So I talked about collaboration before, and sometimes I talk about it with folks about being like radically collaborative, and just this idea of even the way I talked about giving information and advice, just that pause of like, do you even want this? Right? Just being curious and humble with someone, like, you may not even want or need my expertise right now. And that's okay. And then we're very much supporting acceptance strategy. So of course that's about being non-judgmental, but how does acceptance show up for us? It's really being able to be open to people however they're showing up. So if this is someone's 15th time they're trying to manage some aspect of their alcohol use, let's say, then my attitude is like, welcome to number 16. Let's think about all the ways that you've learned about your other experiences. You are welcome, however you show up. And it's never this piece of like, why are you here again? Like, haven't you learned? Like, it's none of that. And one of the most important things we do, and I know I really hammer this a lot in my teaching and training, especially with my students, is reflective listening. So reflective listening and that ability to be an active listener, to mirror somebody back, that is a gift. And it's such a gift of compassion. We're creating so much psychological safety when we're doing reflective listening. Because if I can hear you and I can reflect back to you, what I am doing is I'm saying like how you are and how you're showing up, it's okay. I'm fully accepting you. And then finally, we have empowerment as an important component of this attitude, of this stance. And we're not giving anyone power. People have their own power, but we're facilitating how they come to access their own power. And a lot of that is through choice, and it's supporting their autonomy, helping people recognize that you get to make the choices, you get to call the shots. And we're looking also at people's strengths. It's another thing that we really reinforce. Because folks come in and they know they may have a problem or a concern. That's one thing to know you have a concern, but what do you actually do about it? There's going to be some aspect of change, and folks have to feel confident. Like confidence is an important part of motivation that leads to self-efficacy. And if someone's feeling like I'm so broken, and I have people say that to me, it breaks my heart. I feel so broken, or I've had all this. If I could find areas of strength and be able to state that back to folks, like that's a really important piece in terms of building that sense of agency. And all of these things are connected. Reflective listening is also compassionate, and I collaborate. That's also supporting autonomy, and that's all this kind of wonderful place of really creating again this psychological safety.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the different components that make up reflective listening? There, I think you talk about the sort of peeling the onion. It was the and statements. I think it was continuing the paragraph.
Right.
Could you give us a little bit of an overview of how this can be achieved? Even I'm asking also because working with clients myself that want to work on their conversation skills, this reflective listening is a superpower.
It is a superpower. And I'm so glad you say that. I love when people love reflective listening, because reflective listening actually, I often say you really can't overdo it. You really can't do too much of it if you're doing it well.
Yeah.
And if
you're doing it well, that's
you're doing
important.
it well. That's the challenge. And that's the place where folks, I think, are probably the most challenged when they come to learn motivational interviewing. And it just takes lots and lots of practice. So first of all, when we think about reflective listening and a reflective response, like there's a process that's occurring. And I often describe it to folks, it's like playing a game of catch. So someone's speaking to me and it's like they're tossing me a ball. In this case, they're tossing me their words. And I'm trying to catch it. And whenever I'm listening, I'm trying to notice, am I able to catch this? And if the catching is, I'm decoding. And I'm trying to figure out, like, what do they mean? So another way of thinking about this is that, what they're saying is kind of like the tip of the iceberg. And that, underneath that iceberg, there's, more meaning. And so there's also like the peeling the onion. I think I use in the book, I was taught this. like, I'm not kidding, 40 years ago, when I first was a peer counselor, like, that outer layer of the onion, you kind of peel back, and there's something else underneath. So I'm trying to kind of decode that. And then I'm going to respond back with a reflection. But in that reflection, like I have new words that encode that meaning.
So when you decode this, what is it that
okay,
you're
good question. So I'm looking for what's the meaning of what they're saying. Someone's saying that, but I've always enjoyed using cannabis. It's always made me just feel more relaxed, and I'm trying to think about, okay, what's the meaning of that? Maybe there's a sense of it's helped them really cope. Maybe it's like they found something that really allowed them to fit in. And as I'm thinking, these are some of the different meanings, then I can send back a statement to the person in a way that some of this meaning's encoded. So I might say something like, so cannabis has really helped you fit in some ways, and has helped you be able to cope in a world that otherwise has been really difficult to get by in. And in my little example there, you have to remember that all these reflections are in a context. So even though it seems like this is really hard to figure out, like, how to decode this, I think it's more natural when we're talking to folks because we're hearing their whole story. We know a little bit about them, and the story continues to roll. We're keeping track of their story. So often then, when the person who I'm supporting, like, hears this reflection, like they kind of catch their ball, they kind of catch the ball I tossed back in terms of this reflection. And then if it's on, if it is accurate for them, it's like it adds this meaning. It's like, yes, it is. It's like it helps me cope, and it helps me, feel like I can really fit in. And they keep talking. It's often a very automatic kind of process, and off you roll.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, people will say, what if I'm wrong? What if
I was about to ask that? Yeah. What if I'm wrong?
Sometimes we are. And first of all, there's often more than one way to reflect, and to reflect accurately. There's like a lot of different kind of edges to this diamond of a person, right? A lot of different faucets, and we may say a reflection that's a little bit different than what you would have done, but it all works. It resonates with them, it connects with them, and that they'll continue to talk. Sometimes we're off, and I find that if we're off, it can go in a couple of ways. One, it can be facilitative, and someone might say, well, it's not so much that it helps me cope. It just, I don't know. Sometimes I just feel more normal. Like, oh, okay. So there's this sense of, for you, of what feels right and what feels not so right. And this just helps you feel more right. Mm-hmm. Then I reflect and try to make it more accurate. Sometimes we can be wildly off. I mean, maybe I just really, really missed it. And sometimes someone can get upset. I find that's pretty rare. But it can happen. But even if it does, I think we can always step back and say, in a very transparent way, maybe just reflect in a very immediacy kind of way of, well, I'm noticing here that I was really off there. And maybe we have to apologize. We apologize. I apologize for that. And, help me understand. Then I might follow up with a question for them to clarify. And then I try to reflect on their answer that they might have for that question.
So I'm looking at this with fascination through the eyes of someone who is training people in their social skills and their communication. So I'm not using this in a therapy session because I'm not a therapist. I would be using this with clients that I help to engage with people when they're out on social events. And this listening piece is a huge one for them. I have learned that it seems to be much more for the person that is sharing, someone that is listened to. It seems to be much more important for them that someone is making an effort than someone who's absolutely getting this right. Like, they would rather have, if you're saying something and I will now listen and I'll make an effort to understand and decode and peel back the onion, that, in my experience, is much more important than precisely landing this in the bullseye and precisely finding that very particular emotion that you've been talking about. And also on the getting things wrong side, I found that apart from horrible faux pas, but most of the time, the showing that we are able to apologize opens up a whole new avenue for conversation, because they learn that they are talking with, well, for the lack of a better word, a grown-up who can take responsibility for maybe saying something that was just, guessed wrong. I'm really sorry, didn't mean, like that was obviously wrong. And now, because we know that we have this relationship where apology is like something that is available, now I also open the door for the other person to share more, because now they know that if they should accidentally say something wrong, they can apologize for that, and we will continue. So it just strengthens the entire conversation.
I love that. I love that idea that there's some modeling that's happening there. And there's something else that's really important that you're saying, Michael, that I talk about a lot with folks when I train them, which is it's so much more important to start with like that spirit, the spirit of compassion, and partnership, and acceptance and empowerment, to come from that place of openness and to be flexible in that way than it is to have perfect skills, right? So if I'm coming from a place of really, caring about someone and being curious and being open and flexible, again, that creates that safety that, like you said, if my reflection isn't perfect now and again, it's going to be okay. And there's also a lot of good enough reflection, right? And that as we start to listen to folks and really help kind of peel away their story and kind of move more deeply, our reflection tends to get better, usually. But the reverse is not necessarily true, right? So I can have beautifully constructed reflections, I suppose, but if I'm trying to, control someone, or trying to be too directive, trying to fix and problem solve their situation, like that's a deal breaker. So I can have these great skills, but it doesn't matter because it's not coming from what I call the fertile ground of the spirit of MI.
Yeah. So there are a few more questions that I want to get in. And one of them has been standing out since I opened this book, because it's one of those themes that you have in there. And that is, like you just said, the idea of developing curiosity, both for the person we're working with, as well as us ourselves going through a challenge. This ability to be curious about one's emotions, experiences, and so on. So here's the $1 million question. How do we learn to develop more of a curiosity in regards to pretty much anything, what you're saying, what I'm feeling, what's going on, why something is happening, like a general curiosity, like upping that skill of being curious?
Yeah, I think the skill of being curious is one in which I often advise people, to the extent that, offer them advice around this, and advise myself about, can I first of all just kind of take a breath and step away from my sense of obligation of having to problem solve and having to fix something. Like, let's just kind of take that whole thing like off the table. And I often frame it for myself and others as being curious and being able to have curious conversations. Like, that is the work that needs to be done. Because so many times there's a sense of, we gotta get in there and, get someone to do this thing. And it's like, no, what's important is I take a breath. I find a way to ground myself. And then can I just relax? So just relax in the presence of this person. Maybe thinking, if I'm doing this workbook, as you go through this workbook, just relax within this book of opportunities, the change, the growth, the transformation. It's rooted in this place of curiosity, that when we're able to kind of come with this place of wonder, again, it's back to creating safety. And that when people are able to really express themselves because I'm being curious about you, then they are able to start to notice places of opportunity for themselves. And it's a beautiful way to work, because it is so affirming, and it is so in sync with someone, and it's so respectful.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful way to go through life as well. I almost had a physical reaction to when you said, just imagine there's no problem to solve right now. And it's like, yeah, of course. What if right now, for the next couple of minutes, there's not a problem for me to solve, and I can just be curious about what's going on here, which is interesting, directly applying this curiosity in an interview like this one here, where to a certain degree, yes, you have curiosity because you want to have this conversation. But I also have to admit, like, here's some behind the stage stuff, like something that goes through my mind as we're having this conversation for now almost an hour, like the constantly running thought is, okay, where do I attach my next question? What does the listener want to know based on what was just that? What should I be asking? And then to just drop that. It's like, no, there is not a problem to be had. There's nothing I need to solve right now. Let me just have that conversation, which hopefully, now that I said it, is not going to lead us to a 5-minute awkward pause because there's no follow-up. But that was a really beautiful, what if there is nothing to solve? Brilliant.
Yeah. Right. And sometimes you just reminded me of something. Sometimes people don't have a lot to say, and that there are pauses and there are places where maybe I'm just kind of reflecting on some nonverbal places. And I've found that that's important, right? And sometimes people just need the space. Sometimes folks aren't quite so ready, but there's just this thing of, I'm not going to force you, I'm not going to do anything that feels like emotionally violent. And it's like, it's in this kind of letting go that we actually get something done, right? And that's true in so many places in our life.
And it's also that pause in a conversation between two people that shows, hey, if you are quiet for a second, I'm not jumping in. Like, you can be quiet, I'm still listening, right? This is such a powerful move to not grab the first, like, grasping for air to then jump in and take over the discussion and, talk about our own stuff. Kristin, my last question would be this. If one of our listeners, or many of them, are now thinking, oh, I know of someone in my life who would benefit from this workbook or from working with a healthcare provider regarding their substance use. Of course, this is a tacky subject. I'm not going to text Uncle Bob the link to your amazing workbook because that might be a little bit too much on the nose, at least for the Uncle Bob that I have in mind, not that I know one, an imaginary one. How would you suggest that people that care about a loved one and want to see them get help tackle this subject?
Yeah, people do like share information and resources in terms of books and general like information lines where people can start to do a little bit of research. But I think probably the most important thing, kind of getting back to our curiosity and listening idea, is just to have conversations with people. I know that sounds like completely unsatisfying in such a way, but if someone is maybe having some problematic behaviors, I think our first idea a lot of times as a loved one is like, how do I confront them? How do I approach this topic? And that certainly might be something that comes up. But I think maybe even as a place to start, that's even more important, is just start to connect and just maybe start spending time, just start to wonder with them, maybe take them out and just starting to build the relationship in a way and start to wonder with them. Get back to curiosity about, how are things going for you? If you had some things in your life that you really needed, like what would that look like? And just being curious, maybe these other kind of evocative ideas of, what kinds of things do you need? What seems important to you? And it might not be even that much of questioning. It might just be spending time at a museum or a garden or walking around or just, doing whatever sports or anything just to help reduce kind of isolation and increase connection. Because if someone has a problematic relationship to a substance or process, like it comes up like in the day or maybe in the conversation, it may not come up immediately. And if it still doesn't come up, you still want to talk to them about it, you're in a much better place to start to have that conversation if you've built up some relationship time with them. So I think that would be the first thing I would advise in response to what you just said, Michael, where sometimes just like handing someone a book or giving someone like a resource number might be too much too soon, right? Or might be seen, just like we were talking about earlier, advice that someone is not ready to take. So my answer to that is drop back into the relationship. It may not feel like, oh, that's going to take too long. But there's something we often talk about in motivational interviewing. sometimes if we're trying to do something in such a way where it feels like we don't have any time, it might take all day because we're trying to force something. But sometimes if we act like we have all day, it doesn't take that much time because we're kind of working with someone's energy. So it may seem like, oh, but I really need to work with this person. I'm really concerned about this. But sometimes all of our efforts to try to get someone to get some help actually pushes them away. So starting with a relationship, showing interest in them, seeing what's going on for them, helping them have conversations. That's a way I think that we often can be more productive in terms of helping someone engage in a way that they feel comfortable. And I imagine, of course, there's always exceptions to this. If you saw or had a family member that was really, really impacting themselves or someone else, like, there's a danger issue, then it might be certainly advised, to check in with a professional about some advice if it was like, oh, I'm really concerned about it, imminent concern about this family member or so. But otherwise, I would start with the relational route.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for all that advice, Kristin. That was really very, very interesting, and it was an amazing journey for me to work my way through that book and find out things about myself and how I can do things better in my day-to-day. So I'm sure this book is going to help a lot of people with their own challenges. Where do our listeners who now want to hear more from you, about you, where do you want to send them on the internet or on the world in general to get more of Kristin?
Yeah, thank you. So maybe the most immediate place to go would be my website. It's KristinDempseyCounseling.com, and Kristin is spelled with 2 I's. In my case. And on there, I have just basic stuff for folks who are interested in doing psychotherapy, but I also have different pages around various things I've put together in motivational interviewing, including various videos and podcasts. So if people are interested in motivational interviewing and things that I've done, you can see that, which is great. And another place to keep track of things that I've done and to see about things I'm doing and future trainings and freebies and that kind of stuff would be probably through LinkedIn. So you'll be able to see me there as I sometimes come up with, very brief kind of videos or just little statements about what I'm doing next. So if you want to follow me on Blue Sky.
Kristin, this was a huge pleasure, huge honor. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. I really enjoyed it. Loved your questions. And thank you for working in the workbook. I'm so glad that you found that really useful.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.